Hello, guys. How we all doing? I don't know exactly why, but I'm feeling good today. Even the steaming coffee I spilled on my crotch while writing this story couldn't ruin my mood. My poor sugar cookie cold foam. Yes, I'm that person. And not to make things weird, but it did feel oddly nice after the burn went away. And now I just have wet pant. So, guys, what's the scoop? What's the 411? Anything crazy in the world of true crime that I'm missing out on? Or maybe you'd like me to cover? I still hate talking about myself and would much rather ask you folks some questions to start off an episode. Do y'all like more frequent episodes that are a bit shorter? Or maybe you prefer I jam a couple of stories together for a longer episode, like a mini collection almost? Honestly, I just want to know what you want to know. Are unsolved cases fetch right now? Or maybe it's Victorian era murders keeping true crime fans on their toes. As long as you aren't begging for pedophile heavy stories, I am here for it. Like, I seriously just Google random phrases and choose cases that interest me. So I'd love to have a few more listener recommendations to dive into. Oh, and one last random train of thought that I had before we start today. While my friend Andrew was visiting last week, we devoured this delicious breakfast at a cozy diner downtown, and behind us there were these three sweet elderly women. We happened to catch them mentioning something about podcasting and naturally decided to listen in for a bit. One lady had been brainstorming this idea for a podcast about growing old, retiring, losing your younger self, etc., which I genuinely think is a creative and good idea. But then Andrew and I started our own little brainstorming sesh on how the two podcasts could possibly overlap. Long story short, we couldn't get past the initial question. Does dying count as retiring? We realized quickly that simply changing subjects might be our best bet, which I will be doing now for both of our sakes. Today, I bring you the McStay family mystery. My name is Eli, and this is Murder in the Morning. My sources for today come from an independent article by Sheila Flynn, an investigation discovery article by Aaron Rasmussen, and of course, everyone's favorite, Wikipedia. Now, just for those people who have a love-hate relationship with mysteries and unsolved cases as much as I do, just know this story does have a resolution. Joseph and Summer McStay lived in Fallbrook, California with their two young sons, Gianni, who was 4, and Joe Jr., a 3-year-old. Summer was a real estate agent, and Joe owned a company that built high-end decorative fountains and waterfalls named Earth-Inspired Products. Their life had been a beautiful and normal one leading up to the week of February 4th, 2010. During these days, family and friends had reached out to the McStay family without any response. And when confusion turned to worry, Joseph's brother Michael traveled to their residence on February 13th in order to find out what was going on. According to The Independent, quote, "It took some time for people to become concerned. The family sometimes took small vacations, so it was more than a week before Mr. McStay's brother, Michael, stopped by the house to see if it held any answers to where they might be. He found rotting food and Mrs. McStay's prescription sunglasses. After he reported the family missing on February 15th, police discovered the McStay's vehicle had been towed from a parking lot near the border of Mexico on February 8th. Searches about traveling to Mexico were also uncovered on the family's computer, bolstering a theory that they had gone on a trip. The San Diego Sheriff's Department even posted footage of a family that resembled the McStays walking across the border to Mexico." End quote. This, in and of itself, is quite baffling. Let's, just for example's sake, let's say the family was on vacation. Would they not have told at least one family member or one friend, or at least their work, that they'd be leaving? or when the car broke down, why would they continue to walk across the border? If they have enough money and cash to travel, I'm sure they'd have other means of transportation. I'm kind of just spitballing here, but that theory seems very touch and go. Besides this Mexico lead, all investigators had were 2 phone calls and a shitty surveillance tape clip. On February 4th, the day they disappeared, Joseph made 2 phone calls, one to his father in the morning mentioning something about a lunch meeting later. Then, Joseph placed a call around 8:30 p.m. to his coworker and friend Charles, aka Chase Merritt. Charles told investigators that he had let this call go to voicemail as he had been enjoying a movie at the time. And that's it. Those are the only clues, or rather, simple details for police to work with. A family up and disappeared without a trace. The San Diego Sheriff's Department decided, in the end, to go with the vacation theory, treating their disappearance not as a crime, but as a voluntary missing persons case, thus ending any ongoing investigation into the matter. The authorities seem to be the only ones who believe this, however. Wikipedia noted many issues with the so-called voluntary disappearance theory. Quote, relatives of the McStays doubted that they would travel to Mexico, saying that Joseph and Summer avoided the country because of the safety threat posed by recent drug wars. Other critics of the theory noted that the McStay family had more than $100,000 in bank accounts, with no withdrawal of funds in preparation for a trip, and their accounts were untouched after their disappearance. Summer's sister went on to state that her passport was expired. End quote. Still, no further investigations were done. Everybody except the police were doubting this theory, and sadly, the case remained frozen here for years. It stayed a voluntary missing persons case, so they just didn't have to touch it, essentially. That is, until 2013, 4 long, grueling years later. According to Investigation Discovery, nearly 4 years later, law enforcement was proven wrong when in November of 2013, a dirt biker came across a child's skull in the rugged Mojave Desert outside of Victorville, around 100 miles from the McStay's home. Detectives then made the grisly discovery of the skeletal remains of Joseph and Summer and their children in 2 shallow graves, along with a sledgehammer and an electrical cord, which was wrapped around the father's neck. According to police, the murder victims had been fatally beaten around their heads, faces, and all died from blunt force trauma. Now we have a murder case to solve. This is no longer a disappearance, and definitely not a voluntary one. Police went back to the last day anyone heard from the family all those years ago, February 4th. Who was the last person to be in contact with the McStays? That man was coworker and friend Charles Merritt. When questioned again in 2013, Charles then admitted to spending more than an hour with Joseph on February 4th. Plus, he was also the last person Joseph attempted to contact around 8:30 that night. Initially, Charles absolutely refutes any suggestion of his involvement in their murders, but it doesn't really do him any good. As police focus in on Charles, they learn that in 2001, he stole over 30 grand worth of drilling equipment from a previous employer. And then when interviewing his current coworkers, police found out that people thought he was a bit of a suspicious character. It's then discovered that Joseph may have been sidelining Charles at work, offering a motive for the murders. And throughout 2013 and 2014, into this new investigation, Charles maintained his innocence. To push his story even more, Mr. Merritt here, he told the press that he had planned to write a book about the McStay family, saying that he believed Summer, the mother, had been poisoning her husband and finally cracked and killed her whole family. Rubbish. Just a wild accusation. But none of it mattered. On November 5th, 2014, police arrested Charles Merritt after finding his DNA in the family's car that had been abandoned all those years ago. He was charged with the murders of all 4 family members. And now this trial, unlike most of my other stories, it's a bit more complex and lengthy. Quote, prosecutors alleged that Merritt had a gambling problem and killed the McStay family for financial gain. They said that he wrote checks totaling more than $21,000 on Joseph's business account in the days after the family was killed, and then went on a gambling spree at nearby casinos where he lost thousands of dollars. Merritt's trial was delayed as he had repeatedly fired his attorneys or attempted to represent himself. And by February of 2016, he had gone through 5 attorneys. 2 years later, in January of 2018, a trial-setting conference was scheduled for February. Merritt's attorney filed a motion in the Superior Court in April, arguing that Joseph's business and accounting records were hearsay evidence and therefore inadmissible. But that didn't matter. On May 4th, the case was scheduled to go to trial in July of 2018. And yet again, it was delayed, but it finally started in January of 2019 in a San Bernardino court. After a lengthy trial, on June 10th of 2019, the jury found Merritt guilty of murdering the McStay family. And on June 24th, the jury recommended that Merritt be sentenced to death. The court would go on to uphold the jury's recommendation, and Charles Merritt was sentenced to death on January 21st, 2020. COVID and a death sentence. Get some. Thank God. In my opinion, I believe this dude's... I believe he's guilty simply because of the freaking book idea he had. Only a killer would come up with something that weird and then tell people about it. However, many debates have been sparked over the years whether or not Charles is the killer. Apparently, the McStays may have had a few more enemies than it was let on. According to the documentary titled Two Shallow Graves, there was an astonishing number of other people who had significant run-ins with the McStays. There was Summer's ex-boyfriend, who sent an email to her just months before the family's disappearance, telling the mother of 2 that he would, quote, love her forever. He lived nearby and had been arrested for threatening a neighbor and her daughter. Then there was the new husband of Mr. McStay's ex-wife, a man with a history of violence who allegedly threatened to, quote, muzzle Summer and beat up her husband, Joseph. And there was another associate from Joseph's work, the computer whiz who maintained the entire company website. A man who had previously sent messages to Joseph, essentially threatening to destroy the site and ruin the business. The documentary also points to an advertisement allegedly placed by the same man to sell the water fountain business right from under its rightful owner. Defense attorney Raj Maleen in this documentary series describes this suspect as a, quote, walking, talking red flag. But in trial, Merritt's team was barred from bringing him up or any of the other suspects without concrete evidence linking them to the crimes. Executive producer Jacinda told The Independent, lots of people's names came up and a lot of different theories came up. There's going to be a lot of debate. Honestly, I'm just a little salty that those theories didn't come to light before Charles' sentencing, just to make sure that those leads were thoroughly investigated too. But oh well, no good story is perfect, right? As for Charles, he remains behind bars, although he did hesitantly participate in the Two Shallow Graves documentary, still maintaining his innocence. And according to the producers, he works on his case almost every day, convinced he'll be released from prison at some point. Who's to say, though? Crazier things have happened. And that, folks, is the mysterious story of the McStay family murders. These mystery cases are growing on me. I used to be all about the blood and the gore and the blah, 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 blah. But now I'm just like, give me a good plot and see where it goes. I hope you enjoyed it as well. And if you stuck around this long, I've got a special treat for you. Normally, this is where I say, bye-bye, love you. But not today. As I wrote the intro earlier for the first story that we just finished, I decided about halfway through, fuck it, let's make today a double feature, because y'all deserve it. And what better way to kick off my first two-parter than with a classic German serial killer. Back to the basics, where it all started. Whenever I'm indecisive about a case or just need to give my storming brain a break, it's nice to be able to fall back on a consistent theme. Again, today, I bring you serial killer Rudolf Pleal, aka the Dead Maker. Born on July 7th, 1924, close to the former Czechoslovakia border, Rudolf's life started out and stayed awful. Lacking money, his family was uneducated, starving, and stealing to survive. By the age of 9, he was already smuggling items in and around town to help his family. And at age 13, he had his first sexual experience with a sex worker. And in 1939, by age 15, he left home to work on his own. All within 15 years. And for the next few years or so, Rudolf would work odd jobs here and there, including on a merchant ship all the way down to South Africa, and then back to the army, but was soon determined he was deemed unfit for service. In 1945, he ended up working as a cook in a labor camp. Here it's reported that he would kill, cook, and eat kittens. I'm sorry. That year in 1945 is the year he was alleged to have committed his first murder, but was never charged with the crime. He would boast about killing a Soviet police officer, and then anytime anyone tried to question him about it, he would run away to a different town. At some point along his terrible journey, Rudolf met a few despicable people / friends, if you can call them that. Karl Hoffman and Konrad Schubler. I don't know what water these three were drinking, but for 2 years they terrorized the streets and the mountains of southern Harz in Germany. According to Wikipedia, between 1946 and 1947, Rudolf worked as a frontier worker in Harz and helped paying people, mostly women, to cross illegally from the east to the west, or vice versa. In these 2 years, he raped and murdered at least 12 women, with help from his two accomplices, Karl and Konrad. During the same 2-year period, 13 police officers were killed as well. With an insane amount of unprompted murders, police started going out in groups of 3 or more just for their own self-protection. And then our group of 3 killers over here would have to sneak around town avoiding them. It was literally cops and robbers. Then in 1947, on April 18th, Rudolf was arrested after the robbery of a Hamburg businessman named Hermann Bennen, whose body was dismembered by axe blows and found in a creek. While he was a suspect in other crimes, investigators only had him on this one robbery and killing and had no idea how large a confession Rudolf would make. He would end up confessing to 25 murders in total, but I'm just going to share share the few crimes he was convicted of. Trigger warning, it is kind of rough. In the year of 1946, he killed Erica M., who was 32 years old. She was raped, robbed, and killed by blows to the head. On July 19th, he sexually assaulted and killed an unknown 25-year-old woman in the forest between, forgive my pronunciation, Wachenried and Elrig, on the edge of southern Harz. He used a hammer to kill her. On August 19th, Rudolph and his accomplice Carl lured an unknown 25-year-old woman to the grounds of a freight depot. Hoffman stabbed her in the head with his knife while raping her and then slit her throat. On September 2nd, Rudolph and Hoffman met another 25-year-old woman crossing the border at Bergen. Rudolph killed her with a field stone, and Hoffman buried the body in the forest. In mid-September, Rudolph and Hoffman met a 25-year-old black woman from Trapstad who was going towards the border. Hoffman robbed and killed her in the nearby forest, decapitating her corpse afterward. At the end of November, Rudolph offered to guide another 25-year-old young woman across the border. In the forest between Elric and Wackenried, yet again, he attacked this girl and killed her. On December 12th, Rudolph and Schubler now robbed a 55-year-old widow and beat her with clubs. The woman ended up surviving the attack and was a crucial witness in the trial. 2 days later, on December 14th, Rudolph killed a 37-year-old woman and then threw her body in a well. And 5 days later, killed a 44-year-old woman, throwing her body in the same well. That was all in 1946. Now in 1947, they're not slowing down. On January 16th, Rudolph and Hoffman offered to take a 20-year-old woman to the East Zone. Rudolph killed her near the road that runs between Abbenrode and Stapelberg, and then disposed of the corpse in a stream. In mid-February, Rudolph killed a 49-year-old woman in a forest near Dudersbeen. Hoffman robbed the corpse, and they proceeded to damage the skull after the fact. At the beginning of March, Rudolph and Hoffman committed another murder near the Soviet occupation zone. Hoffman stabbed an unknown young woman to death and then cut off her head. Honestly, what the fuck were these guys doing? And why do they all have the same hobby? So after his confession to all of these murders and the first murder of that businessman, this trial was extensively covered by the media. Rudolph, he was smug and arrogant throughout and claimed to have suffered from a mental illness, hoping to avoid prison time. But this ploy proved massively unsuccessful as all three men were involved. And they weren't going to let each other off. Let's just say that. All three men were sentenced to life in prison in 1950 for multiple murders. Rudolph would end up hanging himself in the cell 8 years later, but not before he wrote a book, of course. Quote, while in custody, Rudolph finally confessed to further murders. In a memoir titled Mein Kampf, yes, after Adolf Hitler's autobiography, he claimed to have committed a total of 25 murders, and thus one more than Fritz Haarmann. In the book, he referred to himself as the, quote, greatest murderer, end quote. Fritz Haarmann, if you don't remember, was a serial killer known as the Butcher of Hanover or the Vampire of Hanover. He was convicted of abducting, raping, torturing, dismembering, and killing 24 young men and boys in Hanover, Germany, during the early 1920s. And I swear I didn't plan this, but I did do an episode on the Hanover Butcher a few weeks ago, if you're interested in learning more about him. Anyway, I think Rudolph just wanted the street cred of having killed more people, even though technically he needed the help of 2 other men to do so. Okie dokie, folks. That will officially be all I have for you today. Again, I hope you enjoyed this little double feature. I had fun. It's nice I was able to flip-flop back and forth between the research and kind of spread my time out so I wouldn't get bored on one or the other. The only issue is that I just have to edit a lot more after, but it's okay. Thank you all once again for listening. I appreciate you and all of your eardrums. Okie dokie. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye. Love you.